It's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shawn Carter, who's the senior scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife and Climate Change Research Center in Reston, Virginia. He's, as part of that program, he leads their research efforts, so he has his own research going on. And he also works in close collaboration and oversight of the, I guess, 8 regional climate science centers scattered throughout the country. So has his hand in kind of original research and also kind of seeing the big picture as well, which is a really cool perspective. Shawn got his undergraduate degree from Cornell and a master's degree from Virginia Tech, and then his PhD from SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry. In wildlife biology, is that you studied critters at one point, right? I forget which critter it was exactly.
I've studied a lot of critters about around.
Many critters.
There's conservation biology was my favorite.
So from conservation, so and practicing, so a good example of those of you who have been taking a class in conservation biology and the diversity of careers that you can go into with that degree. I first met Shawn probably 10 or more years ago at kind of a point in my career where I was kind of changing research directions. And he was really, although I realized yesterday as you celebrated your birthday that you're only a year older than me, but was kind of very inspirational to me in thinking about the importance of, he was working for the National Park Service at the time, and really got me into working in the National Park Service. So for those of you who know me and my passion about national parks, you can credit or blame Shawn for that part. So it's a real pleasure to have you come and kind of share your information, hopefully inspire some of the people in this room as well. So please join me in welcoming Shawn to the University of Richmond.
So how am I for sound? Can people hear okay?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Todd, for it's my pleasure to be here on campus on a beautiful day. When you mentioned the climate, it made me think of, I was in a meeting one time and someone was really priding themselves on citizen science and letting their kids kind of help understand climate change by wearing these little thermal buttons to what temperatures they were experiencing. And I remember they really made a point to say that they thought that was just the best thing that the students were seeing, climate change in action. And I was like, but where were they wearing them? Weren't you indoors most of the time when they were wearing this? I was like, yeah, but it's kind of the idea. And it just really kind of, I just found it comical that someone studying climate change as we are still in kind of a climate controlled environment. So not necessarily the best analogy. But, well, as Todd mentioned, part of my role is to both coordinate research at a national center and synthesize kind of climate impacts on fish, wildlife, and habitats, but then also to really provide kind of broader understanding of the research that's done around the country at our various Department of Interior climate science centers. And frankly, I get kind of tired of talking about a lot of those individual research projects and even some of the topics that we study in my shop. Happy to provide that information and happy to answer questions about that. But in framing this talk, what I really wanted to do is to not give a depressing talk about climate change impacts. I wanted to actually try and highlight some, maybe some of the exciting, from a scientist's perspective, what are some of the exciting, interesting aspects of going into this as a field of study, and maybe try and inspire, or justify going into this line of study. So I asked some of my staff, all of whom are younger than us, why are you in this business? What got you into this business? Because I've kind of been in it for a little bit. I've kind of bopped around. I've studied a variety of systems and critters. But really, when I asked my staff, they kind of gave me some different motivations for why one might be in a climate impacts program and why they might pursue a career in studying climate change. And one of them, one of our directors actually, motivated me to think kind of a personal narrative, why, if I went back and looked at a younger version of myself, kind of what would be my opinion of that person. as I have a younger version of myself looking at me, would they be proud of where I'm at, the kind of study that I'm doing, what I've accomplished, or would they be disappointed that a young idealistic person really didn't have the impact in the field of study that they hoped that they would achieve? And I think that this kind of personal reflection, even mid-career, is kind of useful because it really, I think, helps us understand what motivates us as scientists, what really makes us go into careers. In this article, written as a science piece by Steve Jackson, you know, kind of his motivations for going into science and in climate change impact research in particular, he's a paleoecologist, where really he said that scientists are naturally inquisitive, they're naturally kind of competitive, especially the academic scientists, I think. And then they also want to make a difference. They want to feel that what they do has value to the broader society. And I think that's true. I think that holds true for me personally. I think that holds true for a lot of people in the environmental sciences and science in general, that we tend to be inquisitive by nature. We tend to be pretty driven and focused to try and achieve good things for ourselves and for others. And we tend to have some element of selfless motivation. I think one of the hallmarks of climate change, and perhaps some of you have seen this, is that climate change has been pitched as a wicked problem. And this idea of wicked problems is not a new concept. It first came out in economics probably about 30 years ago. In fact, people now are calling climate change a super wicked problem, which to me sounds a little bit too jargony. But what do I mean by wicked problems? Well, as a scientist, I think that wicked problems are especially challenging because they're inherently complex. They tend to have many interdependencies. They're very difficult to define. They can have unforeseen consequences. They usually have no clear solution. And they can have broader societal impacts and consequences. It usually makes them pretty intractable when you're talking about policy solutions. So climate change, when we think about climate change impacts and global climate change in general, it's really a very tough nut to crack. We spoke earlier today about kind of how this issue in particular has been politicized, how the communication about the impacts of climate change is especially hard, how different segments of society value the implications of climate change differently depending on where you sit. So again, depending on how you view this, you could throw up your arms and just say, well, this is clearly a problem that's too big to tackle. This is going to be a problem that's facing many generations. What can I possibly do to add value to as a scientist to help contribute some solutions? And another thing that happens often, this is often the case, and why I didn't want to give maybe a more typical talk of some of the fields of research that we tend to highlight, local extinction, sea level rise, permafrost melt, increased fire severity. There's just a lot of different impacts that are being discussed that really, I think, over time, there's a quote that I heard recently about conserving the conservationists, and it's really talking about how can we keep a positive message for the future in terms of really instilling a hopeful vision of the future. When in the area of climate change, really a lot of the predictions, whether you're talking about 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, and these are just, degree warming in the atmosphere, 4 degrees, it gets dire and dire. And all of these may or may not happen. There's a high level of uncertainty. They're all highly interdependent. They have broad social and economic consequences, both at the local scale and at the global scale. Now, don't take all of this as gospel. This is just a cartoon. But I use it to highlight the fact that depending on which area of each area of these lines of study could be a ripe career, but they really can't be studied in isolation without understanding the context of others. Another thing that, again, depending on where you sit, can be both interesting or scary is the profound impacts that global climate change will have on the environment. And I could pick many. One that I find interesting that's relevant, I was just up in Alaska about a month ago, and it wasn't looking at methane hydrates, but it was looking at permafrost melt. So in this diagram, this was talking about, some of you might have heard it, it came out about a year and a half ago, but the East Siberian Arctic Shelf, relatively small geographic area, but in terms of the amount of methane that may be emitted should permafrost melt, the amount of methane released would be considerable, in fact equal to the sum total of methane released by the rest of the world's oceans. And there's a lot of uncertainty about how quickly that permafrost may melt, how much methane will be released. Methane is about 84 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. We don't know what kind of positive feedbacks will happen. We don't know what other sinks will be there. We don't know how much it will melt, where it's melting. We're finding that it's melting actually along the perimeter quicker than we had anticipated. But we also have a lot of climate models that don't incorporate this. So these processes are all integrated with the global climate system. They have the potential for huge positive feedbacks, and yet there's a huge amount of uncertainty with widespread ramifications. And so these are the kind of topics that, should people care about this? Well, I would argue that they should. Is there a lot of uncertainty about what those impacts may be? Of course. You can have a lot of gloom and doom consequences. There might be beneficial consequences as well. I think what I would say with this wicked problem is that we really can't defer the investigation, and we really can't delay action simply because of a lack of understanding. It requires a new research framework and model. What I mean by that is, and this would be kind of something that I've learned and began to appreciate more and more, is that when we study global climate change, we really have to embrace uncertainty. We really have to be adaptable. And a lot of these phenomena, even though they are uncertain, will have really profound management consequences. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard in natural resources the concept of adaptive management. And that's basically kind of learning through doing. You try something, you see if it works. If it does, you keep doing it. If it doesn't, you modify and then go back and try and implement it better. In climate change, we can, given that there's a lot of uncertainty, we have things that we may or may not work, but we can still implement this process of adaptive learning. One of the concepts that we promote in climate change research is this idea of scenario planning. And these are different than global climate scenarios, which are basically scripted futures that have a specific economic development trajectory. They have very specific specified assumptions, and you would have a certain amount of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. These scenarios are really scenarios that are, if this happens and this happens, what are the kind of the high and low consequence events that may or may not occur? Some of you might have heard of the black swan, where we talk about very high consequence, low probability events. It's a little bit like bet hedging. But I point this out because really the natural resource management community, the people, the actors that I typically interact with, are really resistant to taking action under highly uncertain scenarios, highly uncertain situations. There's a lot of risk, very little reward. But as I mentioned, the consequence of inaction is pretty dire. So we need to think of ways that we can actually elicit management response in a different way. It's not going to be giving them a research paper with some findings that they can hang their hat on. It's really a process of learning and doing adaptively, cooperatively. Also, what I find particularly interesting in climate change is this is a pretty new area of research. And this is just something very recent. The top is a figure basically highlighting the impact of extreme weather. So you can see just a normal distribution, and what that top figure, which was in the IPCC report that came out in 2007, is just a really elegant way to show that a relatively modest increase in the mean temperature, or in this case the probability of occurrence, a relatively modest increase in the mean actually has a pretty profound increase in the number of extremes that you experience. So when we talk about extreme weather events, extreme temperature swings, a relatively modest increase will have pretty dire consequences. So when someone would ask me, well, why do I care about 2 degrees C change in temperature? The average temperature, 2 degrees C, that's really nothing. Well, the average temperature increase of that small amount might be modest. But if you think about the normal distribution in the tails, it actually really dramatically increases the likelihood of observing extreme weather events that over time do have real consequences. What we can see now is we go from that hypothetical example to some real data. This was released by, this is an infogram from the Center for Climate Change Communication that just came out about a week ago. But we can actually see for these extreme temperature events, this playing out. So it's really, I think it's really satisfying intellectually to see that we now are getting observations that do line up with some hypothesized result or hypothesized phenomenon. There's also a lot of interesting surprises. This is just an example of snowshoe hares in Montana. And one thing, and again, this may be intuitive to a lot of you, one thing that we were finding is that these snowshoe hare populations were actually getting disconnected from their environment in terms of the change in their pelage. So the two top panels are actually where we see that we have snow coming later in the fall than it normally would. We have snow melt happening more quickly, so snow off is going off more in the spring. So you end up with these disconnects where actually the environmental cues that are being used can't keep up with the pace of changing climate, so that you're ending up with animals that are suffering much higher rates of predation simply because they physiologically can't adapt like they used to the changes in environment. Also interesting is the environmental cues that they use for that change in pelage differs between the fall and the spring. So just one example that is a little bit unexpected is having population consequences, and also is just really interesting in terms of which species are able to adapt and which are not, and why that might occur. Another thing along this idea of adaptation is this idea of climate velocity. Some of you might have heard this, but when we talk about the rate of climate change on the ground and how quickly the climate is changing, some species are able to move and cope with that changing environment, others are not. Well, which species can move? How quickly can they move? Where will they be able to move to? Montane species, some of you might have seen the pika, are not able to move. They have a pretty narrow band of habitat that they're able to occupy in these montane habitats. So, kind of given that, another one of my staff said, you know, I kind of mentioned this idea of adaptation and the ability of species to cope, sometimes in unexpected ways. And one of my staff said that, well, one thing you could mention is that thing from Jurassic Park where life finds a way, right? And that there is this element of resilience out there, whether you want to use that term or not, but there is an element of adaptability that just with as much uncertainty as we have of what the bad impacts of climate change may be, you could easily argue that there's a lot of potential for optimism or hope out there that species or critters, systems will be able to find ways to cope with a rapidly changing environment. That's another area worthy of study, maybe one that doesn't get as highlighted as much. But certainly there are some innovative ways and solutions that we can come up with to tackle some of the problems that are going to be faced. Another one of my staff said, they don't really care, Shawn, what you're going to talk about in terms of climate change. They just want to know how they can get a job, whether it's depressing or not. And I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about a perspective of a federal researcher as opposed to an academic researcher. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey. It's in the Department of Interior, and we're meant to kind of be the science and research arm for land management agencies. And I think that there's real benefit to being a researcher, a federal researcher, in that we are meant to be apolitical. We're meant to provide science and research information for managers that is management neutral, policy neutral. It's really meant to just be the best kind of information that you can be presented to allow action. But as I mentioned, with climate change, it's a little bit of a different beast because it's a longer time horizon, there's a lot more uncertainty, and it's a little bit harder for managers to get their head around how they can actually manage. It's also far afield. Combine that with where I am a federal researcher. And climate change, for better or worse, has been a political football for a good many of years. I've already faced the threat of shutdown. I've been through a government shutdown. I've lost, in one case, 16 months of research because of the government shutdown for 2 weeks. It's hard to maintain your optimism as an apolitical scientist in an environment where funding and even public support waxes and wanes for your particular enterprise. So it's nice to feel, I think, personally invested in trying to do work in a new area of research that you believe has meaning and value. But there are challenges as a federal scientist in climate change, in that you really, I think, do need to be extra sensitive to the general public and the public perceptions of your research. You are a civil servant. That does dictate your budget, and it does dictate how people use your information. So when we talk about how people use information, and this is an area that I've become increasingly interested in, but it is one even 10 years ago when I was working with Todd, I still appreciated the importance of science communication. And in climate change, it's especially relevant because not everybody wants information, but everybody's kind of different in how their cognitive frames in terms of how they incorporate information. Even their kind of resistance or willingness to accept information. So I spend a lot of time not only trying to conduct really important, relevant research and trying to synthesize research that will have broad public appeal, whether that be climate impacts to biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services, whether it be the consequences of multi-year drought and ecological systems across the country, or that's climate change impacts to migratory birds in different geographies. All of those kinds of information they have broad public appeal, but how you communicate them and how you actually elicit management action from that information is it's an art. It's an art to do that kind of science synthesis, and I'm happy to talk about what I feel are some good examples of that. But certainly as a scientist, many of us are not trained, I think, to really think about the art of communication when you have a wicked problem, when you have a lot of things that are not easily communicated, and where uncertainty is intractable. It will not necessarily go away. So I wanted to just kind of touch on this subject, and then I'm pretty much done. But one thing that I think will become an emergent topic in climate change as it relates to management in the management community is this idea of knowledge co-production. And again, this is not a new concept. Social scientists look at me like I'm an idiot because knowledge co-production has been around for a long time in other fields. In natural resource management, the idea of knowledge co-production, I think, is especially relevant to wicked problems in that we have managers and scientists together when research is initiated. Why is that important? It's not necessarily the researcher proposing what's relevant to managers or proposing a research project. And it's not managers saying, just give me this or just give me that. It's really a joint discussion about the state of knowledge and what knowledge actually is needed to cause action. So an example of this could be management of any kind of critter. Like think of a fish species, a freshwater fish species, or think of a frog species where we're trying to manage along the Appalachian Trail. Managers want to protect or maintain particular habitats, but they really want to know what the consequence of climate change is going to be. Oftentimes, we don't know how quickly climate will change. We don't know all of those interrelationships. We don't know the consequence it's going to have to that target species. In fact, sometimes we can't even provide the actual variables or data, the model data that they need for their management objectives. So if you're not having managers in the room at the same time, you're basically at a stalemate. The only way that you can get managers to use information or feel comfortable to go forward is to have a joint discussion about what's known and what's not known. And what that requires is a willingness for the science community to be very open and be very transparent about the limits of the state of the science. It's not something that we typically are comfortable with. I've been to many modeling workshops where we talk about downscale climate models and all of kind of the assumptions and all of the kind of the warts that go into those. But there's a reticence to share that kind of lack of, to those assumptions, or kind of that lack of being able to really give up a definitive answer. Because people, I think there's a perception that undercuts the value of the science, that we don't know enough. And I think my pitch here for knowledge co-production is that in some situations, we're never going to know enough. But the risk of inaction or of delaying has profound consequences. So it requires that we have a joint discussion, that we engage the public in really showing what we know, what we don't know, and why we don't know it. But to really get that kind of joint comfort level. And this idea of co-production, in fact, there are studies that show that even though you can give the exact same information, if you generate it yourself and hand it off, or if you invite someone and you have a joint discussion and you produce the exact same thing, there's greater willingness to use the information that is jointly produced. And I think partly there's more investment, partly there's more understanding. So I just really want to highlight that idea of kind of a different paradigm. And there's different frameworks that we can use in the climate change arena. Decision analytic approaches. Some of you might have heard structured decision making. Some of you might have heard scenario planning, as I just mentioned. There's also new risk assessment frameworks, some that the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change is using in their next assessment. So this knowledge co-production, I think, is really something that's exciting, but it requires a new set of scientific skills when we engage with people that are really meant to protect natural resources. And then lastly, and this is one I think that I really hope, at least within our careers, will really start to take shape. And I think we're already seeing some of the early changes. Is that climate change, one of my staff really said that climate change, she feels that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of her generation, and maybe multiple generations, and that maybe someday it will be something that's not necessarily so divisive, but it's really something that galvanizes the environmental community. It could become a call to arms, where we all really recognize that waiting is not an option, and that we have world leaders as well as average citizens who are really willing to take the measures that are needed to address this problem. So with that, I have some credits here too, but with that, that's all I had.
So Shawn's suggestion this afternoon was to present some stimulating thoughts and then to hopefully catalyze a conversation after that. So I think he accomplished the first part of that. So we'll see if it stimulates some questions and conversations amongst us. I can start. I can ask a question. So it makes sense that land managers struggle with uncertainty. We all struggle with uncertainty. And there's a challenge in communication of that uncertainty. But when you have an instance where the science that you're producing or you're synthesizing, gleaning from others is pretty clear cut. The snowshoe hare example maybe is an example where we have snowshoe hares that are keeping their white coats after the snow has melted, and we can, there's obvious consequences of that in increased predation. So you present that information to land managers. Are they acting on this science? Are there examples of managers taking information from science and acting on it? If so, how?
So I can address the snowshoe hare example, but then I'll give you an example where they actually are acting on it. And the snowshoe hare example, it's interesting in that they have some observed predation rates, and they're dramatically higher than average. So they're actually finding that the depredation of snowshoe hares now, based on this mismatch, depending on the year, is so high that they're just gone. And the question becomes, well, how do I manage that? I mean, do we do translocation or something like that, or do I paint the ground white, or I mean, what do you do? With respect to those underlying genetic components, the adage in management from the genetic community is always just maximize heterozygosity or allelic diversity, or you can even get into kind of transcripted proteins, but just maximizing the genetic pool that you have for adaptation. And that even could break down depending on the speed at which some of these impacts are occurring. So that is a situation where we have enough research to show that the populations are prone to local extinction, but really there aren't any quick management measures other than getting a better handle at what are some adaptive gene complexes that might help. Another example that I can think of with respect to trees is that we do see that there are, in the Forest Service, we see some forest managers, they have these forest management plans, and they've actually been required as an agency to have climate change incorporated into their forest management plans. And what we see some of them doing are taking climate scenarios, looking at projected temperature change for the next 50 years, because these plans are 20 years out, I believe. And actually looking at seed stock that they might use, it would be better adapted for that future climate. So when it comes to at least managed trees, there are some examples out there where they are changing their planting, not based on what's desirable now, but what's going to be desirable in the future. Yeah.
So, I don't know if there's a general answer to this, but I'm interested in a challenge for land managers about deciding what the goal should be in the face of climate change. Is the goal to try to conserve the existing individual species or communities as long as possible in the face of climate change? Or is the goal to be good stewards of the new species that are going to be arriving with climate change? And how do you think through that?
It's a great question, and I think that how you choose to manage for climate change is a bit of a throwaway, but it kind of depends on the system and also the particular management objectives that you have. I think Todd and I are familiar with the National Park System, and the Park Service has a mandate to kind of preserve natural processes in function. And I think it's pretty easy for them to say, to try and extrapolate in the future and still manage for those processes and function even though they may change. I think it becomes more difficult when you end up with completely novel environments and completely novel interactions. So in that climate velocity example, we actually have predictions of new species interactions that have never happened in the past. New environments in terms of temperature profiles and match with kind of existing habitats that have never occurred in the past, so we really don't know what's going to happen. So is that a situation where you let it play out, or do you just kind of fight against the machine? And I think there are examples both ways. I think the easiest thing right now, at least in the federal system, is to really try and rethink what their policy mandates are to accommodate kind of a little bit of a shifting focus in the future. The issue is timing. A lot of the management documents that people operate under are short time scales, and they really can't accommodate kind of the shifting baseline. And I think what we need to really think about is if we have climate projections out to 2100, how do we actually take those impacts and bracket them down into a management unit that people actually can work with? And that's where we get into these risk assessment frameworks.
Just to play that out a little farther, I saw an account of questions at Sequoia where giant old trees are showing signs of great stress because of drought. Consideration of, well, should we try and water these trees? You know, they're thousands, 1,000, 2,000, maybe some 3,000 years old. Should they be doing that, or should they be saying, you know what, climate's changed, we're going to lose these things? So for that kind of example, how would you think that? How would you try to think that through about what to do?
I struggle with that. I struggle, and I could name other examples like Joshua Tree, saguaro. I mentioned earlier today glacier, where they're projected not to have glaciers within 50 years in the park. So I think there's an ecological question that you can ask. I think in the case of protected areas, there's a broader societal question you need to ask. And certainly if you're in areas of British Columbia and you're a viticulturalist or something like that, there's actually some monetary questions you can ask with other species. So, yeah, it's a tough question, for sure, especially for long-lived species. Anything else?
Any questions?
Actually, a question. So earlier when you were talking about how scientists are somewhat hesitant to share the limitations of the science with the general public, do you feel like that fear is sort of justified in the context of climate change? Because it seems like people are very willing to latch on to any sort of uncertainty scientists will like give up.
That's an excellent point. And so that's a double-edged sword, right? Because on one hand, I'm arguing for transparency, which I think all scientists should really should welcome and be accustomed to. But when you have a highly politicized subject, and you have entities that aren't necessarily interested in the truth, the objective truth, or the state of the knowledge, but really want to be selective in how they use information, I think that the stakes are higher, and there can be a reluctance to share that information until it's as solid as possible. And I think what I'm arguing is that we need to get away from that model because it obviously isn't productive and it doesn't work. I think that those of you that have an interest in this subject and have aspirations to become a scientist in environmental fields that have these wicked problems need to just be accustomed to really being very free and open with all of your information and trying to engage as many people early on in the discussion as possible. There's always going to be people that want to kind of co-opt the message or be selective, especially in this era of kind of sound bites and gotcha and social media and short attention spans. But really, I think the only way around that is really broad scientific discussion, discourse, and very transparent and open use of the information. Because we're just not going to get to a point where we have this rock solid information that we can throw out there that's bulletproof.
I have a policy question more than a science question, but I'm hoping that you can give me some insight. So we know that the Conference of the Party of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting is in 3 weeks in Paris. What has been the discussion kind of inside the Beltway as far as how much science is influencing U.S. negotiations and U.S. action in Paris as the world decides our future climate policy?
Well, I can say that from my perspective, there's not been a lot of call for position papers from the State Department or scientific input on the impact side. Now, that's very different than on the mitigation side and on the greenhouse gas side. So I suspect that folks in EPA and even in NOAA probably have been much more party to those discussions for position papers. You know, I think to some extent, the COP really relies on IPCC to drive the definitive state of the science. And as we were discussing earlier today, you know, the proposed targets are quite modest, and actually some would argue that they're even inadequate at this point. So I suspect, but I don't know, inside the Beltway, I don't think there's been much discussion of new information, so much as just trying to get folks to move on what's already been put forth by IPCC. In fact, IPCC kind of timelines everything so that they can provide information to the COP. And right now it's going to be really just, I think, who's going to cough up money.
Money.
And is that because the impact side is already pretty well, the information is pretty well established with the impact, so they don't like need more information? Well, that's not what the arguments are about.
Again, it's a little bit out of my comfort zone. I would say in my community, you know, we just don't have enough information to know. I showed that cartoon, but you know, 2 degrees C, 3 degrees C, 4 degrees C, they're all having impacts, many of which we don't even know, but we're trying to provide information on what we have in hand now. I think that's actually a different adaptation for what's baked into the system now. I think is fundamentally different than discussions that are happening or will happen in Paris. We're really trying to staunch the bleeding and try and get on a sustainable trajectory. I think they're just fundamentally different. I think another thing I did talk about, but it's really when you start to monetize impacts. There's a whole reinsurance industry that talks about, you know, they have very good information on the frequency of extreme events and natural disasters, and how much that's going to cost in the future. So you can actually monetize the consequences of climate change. And I think on a global scale, those can be fruitful. How you monetize on a park scale or refuge scale, or even for the U.S., I think, in terms of natural capital and ecosystem services is a different discussion.
When you talk about facing uncertainty and how the need for policy, in your opinion, do you think that push is going to come from environmental groups? Are we going to have to wait until the majority of the public is on board for creating policy? Are we going to have to wait for these big CEOs of oil and gas companies to finally say, yeah, okay, we should do something? Who's going to be like the major push factor for finally getting hard policy enacted?
I think that partly depends on what you are considering, you know, hard policy. We talked a little bit earlier about how public perception is slowly changing, right? Even in a relatively small amount of time, we've seen the public perception is changing in terms of the willingness to acknowledge climate change is happening. I think, you know, we'll probably still see as more science and as broader discussions happen, we'll see, I think, more willingness to really try and put some money to address some of the impacts and maybe try and forestall some of these impacts earlier. To me, I think there's a huge potential for innovation that is not taking place in the U.S. And I think it's unfortunate that we've not been able to position ourselves as leaders in clean energy for a number of reasons. Even the business community, I think there's an awful lot of discussion and leadership that we could show in terms of economics, incentives for conservation, you know, kind of greening our markets and things like that. So I think it's going to be multi-sectoral in the U.S. And, you know, in terms of what's going to instill that kind of willingness more broadly for public support, I don't know.
What's the role of the resource manager on educating users on climate change impacts?
Yeah, I think that's a great great question. And that is actually one that I've seen firsthand politicized as well. It was funny, I funded a study one time on social network analysis. It was for the Forest Service, and we had a survey, and we wanted to ask where managers were getting their information on climate change, kind of see who their trusted resources were, and also what some of the barriers to them using that information were. And the response I got back from, well, I got multiple responses, but eventually it got kicked up the chain, and I got a call from their head office in climate change, and they said, well, the survey is kind of a silly thing to be issuing to our employees. And I said, well, why? It's really important. If I'm providing climate information, I want to know their willingness to use it and where they're going for the information they have now. And they said, well, every employee of the Forest Service will basically adhere to our policy on climate change, and those are their marching orders. Their personal opinions have nothing to do with whether they use that information or not. And I said, are you serious? You honestly believe that all of your employees are going to basically adopt your policy, which may or may not change with each administration, on whether to use climate change information or not? It's not the case, but we see that park interpreters and also people, actually the science communication staff that some of the agencies have, are really getting quite savvy, I think, in communicating with the public. And I think the Park Service right now, for example, is using parks as these living laboratories to really help people understand how climate change is playing out. And it's kind of neat because you can see it multi-generational. You can see people that visited parks and already experiencing change, they can bring their children there and kind of describe how it's changed. And I mentioned Glacier before. We have photos from back in the 40s, and you can actually see the retreat. So I think there's a lot of neat, new, innovative ways that we can be talking about the issue. And there's actually some science communication groups now all around the country that are cropping up that are focused specifically on how to do it better.
I just wanted George Mason kind of here.
Yep, George Mason is one.
So in Virginia, we have a really nice system of nature preserves around the state. Quite a few of those are coastal, Chesapeake Bay, Atlantic, at sea level. And so we've made some decisions that have seemed on the surface relatively easy anyway, in terms of places not to purchase, because the Mirage models, why would we spend money there? But underlying that remains some trepidation about where we go making the right decision. And then we're just really starting to have a conversation about places that we need to be buying as retreat zones for some of these existing preserves. And we're really just starting that conversation, so I think we don't have much in the way of sort of good science or research or other examples to look at that be thinking about buying upland agricultural fields and how will that play out over the year. So we're anxious for information or starting to have that conversation.
That's a great, I mean, that's ground zero, right, for management when you're trying to implement adaptation planning. And it makes me also think of this idea of coastal resilience, and primarily in the Gulf Coast, where you actually have this idea of promotion of coastal habitats and restoration of coastal habitats, which has been, an important management priority for a long time, but now it's actually revitalized as being even more important because it's, you can buy upland, but why not try and do a better job saving what's right there now and stop the retreat? We're actually finding in the Gulf, with climate change, we're finding mangroves that are actually migrating quite rapidly and changing coastal habitat. In a sense, kind of a coastal hardening, which is interesting. But then also we're getting this kind of bimodal distribution where they're shifting offshore because they're changing the sediment deposition patterns. So you're actually ending up with mangroves that are offshore on these sandbars as well. It's very interesting. Another one of those surprises that we didn't think of.
Maybe one last question.
You know, I think as a very old person, I think it's kind of very important if we younger people and us old people support volunteer environmental organizations like the Southern Environmental Law Center, the Natural Resource Defense Council, and all these, they are really producing results in much smaller parts. But that way, I mean, you feel part of it, and you want to be with it, and you get inspired by it, because they send out bulletins, and you young people have it on the internet. I don't even have a computer, and I'm still, involved like this. And it gives you at least the feeling that you're doing something, and not just stand there helplessly, and oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed, And when you think that the Southern Environmental Law Center, they're really lawyers, and lawyers want to make a lot of money. Those people don't get that much money, but there is their heart and their mind and their souls to help everybody, the people and the environment.
It's a very great point, yeah. It also makes me think of slight tangent, but related, citizen science is something that I think has really started to come into the fore in terms of getting scientists involved with collection of data. And we even see that in climate change. We have something in called the National Phenology Network, where we actually have scientists collecting data in terms of one's called Project Budburst, where actually people just record when things start flowering every year, and we can actually use that information to help track changes in seasonal timing for different organisms. I think it's a great thing, and I think it's something that we are encouraging, but need to really encourage as well more.
Two very tangible examples of how we get involved to tackle this wicked problem. Thanks so much, Shawn. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.